everyone. So, first live chat. I thought I'd come on here a little bit early just to get everything all set up and ready to go. I got my questions ready that people have submitted in. I've got plenty of items to talk through and resources and bits and bobs. So yeah, we'll just go from there. But do let me know if you can see and hear me okay. And we'll just wait for some more people to arrive. Ooh, 7 people. Hi. Do feel free to get in touch and say hi and pop on comments down here and introduce yourself and go, oh, who's this crazy lady in a red hat? Hi, got a thumbs up, that's cool. Oh, it's a Jenny. Hi, Jenny. 11 people were climbing, that's good. Got to remember to keep my glasses on and keep my head tilted so I don't give you guys like glare off of the screen too much. Got my overseers here, Bill and Bert. That one's Bill, that one's Bert. Jenny Heath is watching. Hi Jenny, good evening. 16. Oh, we've all of a sudden just jumped up. Oh, that's great. Susan, hi. Nice to see you. I'm good, thank you. Jenny, oh, you can hear me. Oh, that's good. That's always a good start. Fabulous. We've got a Keith as well. Hi, Keith. Hi. Hi, Vegard. Popping up. 24 people. Oh, this is good. Hi, Debbie. Nice to meet you. Oh, this is really strange but funny. Wonders of modern technology. Gosh. I've no idea, by the way, what the time is or how long things are. Hi there. Hi, Christine. Yes, hi, Bill and Bert. Hi, Liz. Got some starter tips for you, definitely. Great to hear that you're starting learning nalbinding. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Eileen. You see and hear me okay? That's grand. Yes, as I was saying, sorry, before I got distracted by saying hello to everybody, I have no idea what the time is, so I'm just going to keep on waffling, give it a couple more moments, and then we're going to crack on with some questions. Oh my God, don't put me on the big screen. It's scary. Hi, Shiva, nice to meet you. Yes, I am going to talk about naalbinding and stuff, Vegard. Hello, Jon. Nice to meet you. Awesome. 23 people. That's not bad going. That's more than I thought. Oh, somebody has a question. Love questions. So yeah, what I'm going to do, guys, is I have got a list of questions that people have very kindly submitted over to me this week. So I'll go through them, and as questions pop up on the screen here, I'll do my best to grab them and catch them and answer them. But you know, as I'm going, if there's something you want to interject on or ask about as we go, just give me a heads up and we'll go from there. But yeah, do feel free to ask any questions that you might have that are nalbinding, needlebinding, nalebinding related, all the bindings, all the bindings, mainly with naals. Oh gosh, it's 2 p.m. in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Blimey. Yeah, people joining from all around the world. This is really rather surreal and quite cool. So awesome, 32 people joined in. Hello everyone, good evening. Evening, 8 p.m. evening in the UK at the moment. I'm based in York, so that's grand. Oh, that's a very good question. Developing a 1st century Romano-Germanic impression, and I'm seeking recommendations for period correct wool. I'm super new to fibre arts and still learning terminology. The search has been a bit daunting so far. Yeah, I completely get that, Amelie. But yeah, we can definitely talk about that. Please remind me once I've gone through all the other different questions and stuff. We'll talk about how to get started with a Romano-Germanic impression and correct wool and stuff such as that. Hi Liz, just down the road in Doncaster. Good evening, nice to meet you. Cool, awesome. Right, well, we've got quite a few people, so I think we're going to crack off with, hi Luna, with our first question, which came from Jenny. She got her first question in, and it was all about socks. So, nalbinding socks. How to nalbind socks. So, I've got her questions written down here, and she basically said, is it better to start at the ankle end? Which pattern or technique is more authentic? I would assume you're talking about Viking period portrayals, Jenny. And what is easier to do? Well, socks. Nalbinding with socks. They're difficult. And they're difficult for a very, very good reason. Because, as some of you may be aware, nalbinding is a technique where you use one single needle. I can show you. One single needle and long lengths of yarn in a looping technique to slowly build up your textile. There are many different types of stitches that we have archaeological evidence for, but when it comes to socks, we're very fortunate because here in York we have got the Coppergate sock, which was found in 10th century deposits when the excavation for the Jorvik Viking centre area was being done in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. So when it comes to starting making a sock, best thing to do is start with your stitch. You pick a stitch. So if, let's say we're starting with the Coppergate stitch, the York stitch, you have your sock like here. So your stitch is going to give you the depth, the pattern, the finish of your item as you go through and create your sock. But when it comes to starting, I would always recommend, and indeed from all the archaeological examples we've got, a lot of them from the Viking Age, they all start from the toe end. So you start off with a small knotted loop in the middle here, and whatever stitch you're using, you are going to slowly spiral out the textile until you get to the width of your foot, just here. And then once you've got that width, you can try it on your foot as you go, adjust the tension, adjust the fit, and you go from toe end up to the front part of the ankle. Now, Jenny was talking about the different methods of making your socks, and there are many different methods. For example, the Coppergate sock is made by getting to this tube shape. You then stitch out a rectangular beam for the heel here, and then you manipulate the stitches up by increasing and decreasing and pulling in at the side to make the textile turn. So you're in effect creating like an envelope for the heel. That's why the Coppergate socks are thought to be little ankle socks rather than, you know, full socks, because you've got the lower ankle curve and you've also got this row of stitching along here where it goes around the bottom part of the ankle. So all this part of the textile that's been null bound actually just shapes and holds the ankle and the foot area really well, which is why this type of sock, when you null bind it, is really, really comfortable. If you do it in York stitch and a slightly thicker wool, you get really, really comfy, warm socks. Really good for modern slippers, perfect obviously for historical reenactment if that's what you're after, creating a representation for. But there are other examples. So for example, there is a sock that was found in Ribe and Uppsala in Sweden, and they have been made by doing this first tube from the toe backwards, but rather than doing the manipulation in the textile, what the crafter has done is created another little circular dish, in effect, like a little hat for the heel that's going to fit on the heel, and then they've attached it to this textile. So you've kind of got a two-piece item that's then joined together, which is really good. Some of the earlier examples, like we're talking about the Romano-Egyptian socks that have been made, and we've got examples for, they're made out on a small little beam, and then you go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards to build that textile up. So that's a little bit more similar to kind of modern crochet and knitting, if you like, but you are doing a different stitch there. You're doing a Coptic stitch, which is slightly more complex and more akin, if you like, to knitting as we would know it today. So in terms of what pattern is more authentic, if you are doing Viking period reenactment, I would very much recommend trying to learn the all-in-one technique, where you're learning how to manipulate your stitches and shape from the toe all the way back up to the heel. The reason I say this is because as soon as you start to learn how to conquer the stitches, tension, your stitch manipulation, how to shape the heel, how to add in stitches, how to correct a mistake, once you crack that with socks, the world's your oyster. Honestly, you'll be able to make some really, really nicely fine items, because that's the thing. Nalbinding is not a technique, a historical craft technique that's based on patterns. It's all historically, from the archaeology, it's based on taught, learned knowledge that would be passed down from one individual to another. You've got different stitch variation, obviously, where different people have either created their own stitch, or have tried to learn a stitch and then got it slightly wrong and ended up creating another stitch altogether. You have regional variations as well. You have family variations and different group variations. So nalbinding is a really good bit of sort of experimental archaeology, but also social history too, because, you know, we've got better archaeological evidence for nalbinding in certain cultures and historical time periods than others. But socks are really good to make, obviously, once you've got them. But, yeah, they're not the easiest to make. And it's not the easiest thing to do either, Jenny. I'm sorry. But yeah, I mean, you can use thick yarn to make socks. You can use very fine yarn. The Coppergate socks are made out of a very, very fine 2-ply yarn. Very, very tiny stitches you'll see when you have a look at those. So yeah, all I can say, Jenny, is persevere. There are some interesting resources online that I can send you a link for regarding socks as well. But yeah, it certainly needs looking into a bit more. Historical and an archaeological point of view as to how to make socks. But we have got some from the Viking period, and from just the later period in medieval Uppsala as well. But yeah, the Coppergate sock, which was found in York, is one of the best. So yeah, very, very happy to be living in the town where the Coppergate sock survived. So there we go. So yeah, thanks Jenny. Thanks for the sock question. That's wonderful. I'll go on to another question next, which comes from Arlene, and she asked, how do you... Oh, I'll get the right question. It helps, doesn't it? It's a good thing I've got my glasses on. Arlene asked, did they ever attach fur to nail-bound hats or mittens? We don't have any archaeological evidence at the moment to suggest that. A lot of the nalbinding that has been found is either monochromatic, so it's either a single colour of yarn that's been used throughout the item, whether it's a hat, sock, glove, pouch, or whatnot. We have striped yarn examples as well, alternating different colours in the same thickness of yarn. And we have embroidered examples as well from different cultural contexts, especially in Finland. But in terms of fur, we don't have that evidence. There was a paper published a couple of years ago which spoke about fur use on clothing in the Viking period. I believe Penelope Walton-Rogers was doing some work regarding that. So yeah, we don't have any archaeological evidence for fur on naalbind mittens at the moment, but you never know. We'll give it a go and see what happens. In digging, you know, anything can turn up. So let's go on. How... oh, this one's from Heather. Yeah, how do you turn a doily into a hat? Brilliant question. Brilliant question. Well, hat. Hat. Right, let's talk about hats. So, yes, when I meet individuals like Heather that are naalbinding, one of the common things, well, yeah, I get the starting from the central point and spiralling it out. I get the increasing and I get the decreasing, but I keep going and end up with a doily or dinner plate. And that's fine if you want a doily or a dinner plate. But if you're going for a hat, like I spoke about with the socks being quite complex to make, if you're making a nail-bound hat, it's a good idea to learn how to get your stitch manipulation from the top correct. So what I would recommend is when you start to nail-bind a hat, you are so that you can see where you're getting this nice slope and shape. Whether it's going around your own head or somebody else's head, you can obviously make it via a measurement system, or you can keep popping on your head to try. But you're aiming for an increase that's nice and even, so that it's going to go over the crown of your head if you're doing like a simple beanie type hat like this. When people end up getting to sort of the dinner plate stage or the doily stage with the naalbinding, yeah, you have over increased a little bit, but you don't have to fret too much, because you can rescue your nail-bound items. That's the brilliant thing with this craft, is if you've increased a bit too much, you can decrease via stitches and you can sort of bring and coax the textile back in again, or you can finish your item and then you can felt it if you want afterwards, and obviously shrink it if it's made out of wool. So I can give you a quick tip, if you like, for if you do end up with a doily rather than a hat, is if you get to the stage where it's too big and you're kind of thinking, yeah, I want to start doing the walls and graduating down the side of the hat, really, I want to start sloping, what I would recommend is pull in, i.e. miss a stitch at each corners of the hat. Go round the hat, nail-bound round the hat, maybe 3 or 4 rows, so you can see how the textile is going to come in. And if that is coming in at the right kind of gradient for the hat size you want, just keep on nail-binding down, and that should create the walls of your hat. If it's still a bit too big, because you've really sort of over increased, then you might have to you know, do the 4 points again at either side of the hat, miss the stitches, and then, you know, carry on round so that you can get that textile to shape properly. But yeah, it's all practice. I mean, obviously there are loads of different shapes and styles of hats. This one is made out of Icelandic wool, lovely Icelandic wool in the single Danish stitch. It started at the top here. It's a big old beanie hat. You get different finishes depending on what different yarns you use as well. So this is a really fine 2-ply hand dyed madder yarn, which is quite bouncy but holds its strength quite well. And again, this is started from the top down, so it's all hats, but you can rescue them for sure with the tip. Let's have a little scroll through some of the comments, because I see we've got 26 people watching. Hi, 26 people. Oh, there's Jenny saying thank you. You're very welcome. No problem at all. If anybody has any questions on their naalbinding journey or out of curiosity as they go through things whenever, please feel free to message me via Nidavellnir on my Facebook page. It's what I'm here for, is to answer questions, you know, every day, day in, day out. That's what I do. What's your favourite flavour of wool? Thanks, Tom. Sheepy wool. Love a good bit of sheepy wool. Yes, this is my single Danish stitch hat that I made. This hat is now 10 years old. It was the first thing that I made, as I was told that I looked very much like a little Nissa, a little tomt. I thought, well, I've got to have a hat to go with these guys, haven't I? So yeah, that was one of my first projects, Arlene. So yeah, thank you, Heather, for that question about how do you turn a doily into a hat. I hope those tips help. You know, give me a shout if they do help. Now we have a really, really interesting and broad question from Maria next. And this could be a PhD thesis, this could be an hour-long documentary, but it's a really good question, actually. She'd just like to generally know more about the archaeological finds for naalbinding in Northern Europe, which is great, you know, and that's the thing, when people talk about naalbinding, if they know about naalbinding, they might know about the Coppergate sock, but an awful lot of people will think, oh well, there isn't any archaeological evidence, you know, for any other types of naalbinding, surely, because, you know, a lot of naalbinding tends to be made out of wool or plant fibres, so over time it's going to degrade in the soil. So we are limited for sure from an archaeological point of view as to what material and what remains survive over time, but we do have a nice little data set, especially when you sort of do little snapshots into different cultural periods and time periods. Like if we were going to talk about the Viking-Age in the Viking period, sort of like from 800 AD through to around 1066 AD in the UK, there are, throughout just that time span, some really nice examples. There's a really lovely, really large mitten that was excavated in Iceland, which is naalbound in the Oslo stitch. Big hands, big hands. But that was preserved really wonderfully. I saw that. That's in the National Museum of Iceland in Reykjavik. You can go and see that. I very much recommend that. The interesting thing about some of the archaeology from this period is that in places like Greenland and the Faroe Islands, we don't seem to have any sort of naalbound textiles surviving, but what we do have in Greenland and the Faroe Islands is an abundance of different types of needle, which is really interesting, because there's this sort of bit of a debate in archaeology about you know, how on earth do you know what needle is being used for what craft, what item. You know, how can you tell the difference between a needle that's being used for making netting, for example, to a needle that's being used in textile making or naalbinding, for example. So in Greenland and the Faroe Isles, they've got different materials that the needles are made out of. Some are really small and thin and narrow. Some are really sort of fat and wide. So there's, again, another very interesting paper about nalbinding in the Faroe Islands that has been written recently about what this needle technology might infer about what the finished items might have looked like with the Faroese tradition of nalbinding during the Viking period and later. There's another really interesting example from Norway. It's not a garment item, it's a milk strainer that's actually nalbound in the Oslo stitch, but it's made out of cow and horse hair. And this is the other thing. People sort of tend to think that back in the past, even in the recent past, that the only kind of fibres that are being used is just wool, you know. But there's so many different bast fibres and plant fibres and other animal fibres as well that are being used, which have really good properties, really strong, really durable, depending on what, obviously, the item you're making. So yeah, the Norwegian milk strainer is really interesting. And when you look at that, actually, Heidi, that's a doily, basically. It's a big circular null-bound disc, obviously, that would have been put on top of a bucket and then everything poured through and strained out the milk and the curds and whey and everything else as well. Sweden has some other good examples. I mentioned a few of them. We've got, obviously, at Ribe and Uppsala, both of those are socks, and we've got some long socks as well that have been found from that period. We've got some examples from some of the bog deposits in Denmark too. One of the sort of earliest examples of nalbinding, which dates to around 4200 BC, was actually found at Tybrandsvig, which was a Mesolithic riverine site. It's hunter-gatherers. There's netting, textiles, loads of really, really interesting early material. But part of that collection that was sort of discovered in some of the really wet waterlogged deposits there were some of these early textiles that are gnarbound, which is fascinating. So yes, Denmark has got a really good collection of gnarl-bound items from the Mesolithic all the way through the Viking-Age into the medieval period as well. Germany has got a couple. One of the most interesting yet not well known archaeological examples is of a Viking-Age hat. And when I say Viking-Age, it dates to around 1000 AD. It is a reliquary hat, which is null-bound in the Saltdale stitch. So it's a little similar to York stitch, but it's got a silk band around it. I've got a reconstruction sort of it here. So you have the top part that is null-bound, and then you have a silk band, which is then sewn together with silk thread, and then gold thread around the outside. So like I say, this is a reliquary hat, so it would have been used and or worn by a member of the clergy, member of the faith in the 11th century, and it's been kept as it is, perfectly preserved in the collections in Trier, because it's been kept in a reliquary box. It's been kept in one of the collections of the churches in Trier. So yeah, the wool's preserved, the silk's preserved. It's obviously a little bit worn around the edges, but it's a really, really good example of a 11th century hat. Of course, we're talking about hats. There are other examples via iconography that we can look at regarding Viking period hats. So we've got some of the manuscript evidence that are being created in the Anglian period, talking about the Scandinavians coming over, and especially in St Edmund's Psalter, you see the Vikings depicted coming ashore in conical hats, which is really interesting. You've obviously got the Middleton warrior, you've got stone sculpture to look at. So in terms of art and iconography for clothing, for portrayal of items like hats and socks and gloves, the opportunity and possibility is definitely there, and we've got some of the archaeology to back it up. But yeah, there are some really good snippets of archaeological evidence that we can look elsewhere to try and find out what kinds of styles and shapes of hats, you know, would have been worn during that period. So yeah, I thought I'd just throw that in there. Why not? And then we've got UK examples, of course, of naalbinding. And now everybody obviously just thinks sort of the most famous one is the Coppergate sock, and rightly so. It's a beautiful example. For those of you that don't know what the Coppergate sock looks like, I have a slide. There you go. And that one there is actually the Icelandic mitt. Very well made. But yes, this is the Coppergate sock up here. And yes, the Coppergate sock is not the only Viking period naalbound textile that has been found. There is a naalbound fragment that was discovered during the excavations when Dublin was being excavated in various different stages. It's a scrap of naalbound textile, but it is of its own unique stitch and form, so it's been called the Dublin stitch. There's been several different interpretations as to, you know, how to reconstruct and recreate this stitch, which is very interesting. But because it's such a very small fragment of naalbound textile surviving from the 11th century deposits, it's very difficult to infer what kind of item that would have belonged to or, you know, come from. You know, there's only so much we can do with the evidence that we're given. And then there is also another impression of a naalbound fragment on a burial in Scotland too. But what we tend to find in Scotland, especially in the Northwestern Isles and along Orkney and Shetland, is that because the soil is so free draining, you just really don't get any of the textiles being preserved. You get skeletal remains, and you get the harder wearing items like bone, antler, whale, of course, whalebone, preserved better, but textiles in sort of the North Atlantic don't survive very well at all. So we are a little bit limited. But yeah, like I say, in the UK, we actually have evidence of 3 archaeological items from the Viking Age when it comes to naalbinding. So there you go. Yeah, the other example that I was just going to quickly mention, of course, are all the Finnish examples. You've got your wonderful Finnish narrative that has been carried on all the way through as a cultural tradition for hundreds of years, and you can see the development really nicely from some of those items. The Finnish stitches are some of the most complex to do. You have double and triple loops in some of them, creating some wonderfully thick, really durable textiles, but very complex technique to master. So yeah, kudos to those Finnish people for teaching each other those wonderful stitches. But what I was going to mention actually is there's a really good paper about naalbinding in the 11th century that has been written by Kristof Janto, which is very much a recommended read. You can get it on PDF online, and it's in the public domain. And that just kind of talks through the bare basics of Finnish naalbinding from a cultural heritage point of view, what the archaeology for it is, and yeah, just gives you a different cultural perspective, really. Because, like I say, whether it's a time period or a culture, there are obviously different applications and techniques and materials used in each culture and over different time. Because each individual craftsperson uses their own individual skill to create their items. And that was true 1,000 years ago and more. And it's true today. When you look and watch a craftsperson work, they will have a set of techniques that they have learned inherit, and they will apply them to their best knowledge and skill set. But obviously there'll be adaptations along the way. So that's about the archaeological finds, really. There's quite a few, like I say. I've mentioned some of them. So yeah, do feel free to go and have a look online, check them out. There's also some really good archaeological examples of nail-bound items in Latvia, actually, as well. I met a lady at a conference last year who was going to put the papers for that, actually, so I need to chase her up, actually. So yeah, there's some really surprisingly good resources out there, actually, from the archaeology. The problem that we have is that nobody as of yet has collated or started to collate it from an archaeological point of view and then assessed it from a heritage craftsmanship point of view, because you've got the academic understanding of the archaeology and what's going on, of course, from a craft point of view, but then you've got the practical knowledge able to reproduce the craft and understand how it works and its pitfalls and its positives, you know. So yeah, there's plenty more scope for sure for writing research on naalbinding from different cultural points of view, different periods, different materials being used. So yeah, thanks, Maria. That was a really good question. That's a really good one to waffle and chat to, really. So thanks. Okie dokie. I've got one more question that was sent down to me. It was sent down at the last minute. It got in there by a whisker. It's from Christine, who asked about North American finds of naalbinding. Are there any North American finds, or do I know any more about North American finds? Because she's curious as to the connection between the naalbinding that is in North and South America. Actually, there are Peruvian examples of naalbinding, and what's the link, basically, you know, between those examples and the ones in Scandinavia and indeed even in Central Europe? And the answer to that is we don't know. Because, like I say, we can only what is needed is for all of the examples culturally and historically to be investigated based on their individual locale, so that we have a bigger and a more comprehensive data set to be able to make and ask these big questions, like how do the South American and North American nail-bound items compare to the Scandinavian material? Can we track and trace any kind of craft technology or movement or skill set or anything like that? But like I say, we haven't got enough data, and we haven't to be able to ask those big questions yet when it comes to naalbinding. So yeah, lots to do. I'm trying to do a little bit of it. But there, like I say, there are other people out there working in their various cultural fields and archaeological fields. So yeah, that's the end of our questions that have been submitted. So thank you again, Jenny, Arlene, Heather, Marie and Christine, for sending through those questions. That was really, really nice, actually. I wasn't expecting to have so many interesting questions pop up, which was really cool. So I hope what I've waffled on about kind of helps a little bit. I've been trying to keep track of everybody as I've been waffling on. It's very easy to get distracted by reading your lovely messages and see who's joining at what point. But yeah, I guess now would be a really good opportunity, actually, just to throw open the floor, really, and say, do you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask me about naalbinding, tips for any current projects that you're working on? Alexandra, it's good to see that you're making a hat right now. Keep up the great work. Yes, there are, Alma, there are examples in Latvia. There might be a couple of examples in Lithuania actually as well, yes. I remember talking to the academic about that. So yeah, what's the best stitch to start naalbinding? Awesome question. And the thing is, everybody tends to state, or a lot of people tend to state, that Oslo stitch is the beginner's stitch. I would disagree, and I'll tell you for why. Because you have 3 different types of stitch. You have your simple looping, you have your double looping, and you have your complex looping. So Oslo stitch is complex looping. So for a beginner, what you're doing with the needle, where you're picking up, where you're going under, where you're pulling through, I've tried to teach beginners Oslo stitch for many years, and when you're teaching beginners right from the bare basics about how to do it, it's really complicated to start off with a complex looping stitch or even a double looping stitch like York. So for a beginner, I always recommend a simple looping buttonhole stitch. It's basically a blanket stitch. It's what my hat's made from. I use it an awful lot. It's what this glove is made from too, because it creates a really nice dense textile. It takes a while to make your items, but you can see your items grow quite nicely and you get more control over the stitch. But once you get used to how the stitch moves and how you work with a simple form of stitch, when you then progress onto something like the York stitch or the Oslo stitch or a Finnish stitch, you are understanding the kind of tension and manipulation that you need to create your textile then. So I would really recommend stitch. A really good stitch to start is, let me find my book, is the single Danish, which I have put in my book, Nalbinding for Beginners. It says backwards. But yeah, in my book here, which is part of the beginners tutorials, it teaches you how to do the single Danish stitch. There is a textile fragment that is made in this manner from Denmark. It just tends to get overlooked. Simplest things normally do. But if you think you have this one simple loop for creating your nail-bound textiles, you can quite understand how other people would think, well, I need to develop a way of speeding this textile process up, or I want to try and do a textile, or you know, I want to create more variation. So yeah, always start with your simple looping stitches if you are a beginner, because if you go on to York stitch or Oslo stitch, you're going to confuse yourself, as I've encountered many years when trying to teach people about naalbinding. Where is the book available? The book available, my book, this book, Dolores. This book is available online. I've had to shut my Etsy shop temporarily. It is now open again, and I've made this into a ebook, an online digital format that you can purchase, so you can learn via that way. I do have these obviously in hard copy, so you can purchase them once the world has stopped going wonky and everybody's safe and well again. I'll be putting all my nail-bound items back up on the Etsy store. I have a starter, a Nalbinding for Beginners starter kit as well, which has all the wool, has the needle in as well as the book. So yeah, there aren't really any resources that just talk about the single Danish stitch, the buttonhole stitch. You've got to go through all the different archaeological material before you find it, which is why when people say, oh, what's your source for the single Danish stitch? It's there, and I'm trying to write articles to be able to highlight it more because it's just overlooked. So yeah, there we go. Oh, you're welcome, Liz. No problem at all. Brilliant. Right, I'm just going to scroll down because loads of you are commenting and I've missed you. Great question, Alma. Are you going to do any online courses or classes? Well, before the world went wonky, I was working towards getting a actual sort of workshop, beginners, naalbinding for beginners workshop set up in York. But like I say, the world's gone wonky and things have changed a little bit. And yeah, obviously I've had to look at how to do an ebook to get my book easily accessible to everybody, trying Facebook Live for the first time to see how that works. So yeah, now that I'm familiar with this platform, doing online definitely be an idea. Do something maybe through my Patreon page as well that I've just recently put up to do an online course, which would be really good. So yeah, I've definitely got things in the pipeline to tinker around with. What is your Etsy store called? Fabulous question. I haven't actually said it, had I? I will show you. Oh, it's not going to work because it's going to be back to front. It's Nidavellnir. Look for the red bear. Nidavellnir. Yeah, same as my Facebook page. So yeah, if you put that in there, you should be able to see my one item that's listed in my Etsy shop at the minute, which is the digital download. But like I say, I've got loads of stock. I've got so many things waiting to go to people's homes when they purchase them. It's just obviously with the world going weird, I can't get out to a post office at the moment, so I just have to hold the phone on that one. So yeah, let's have a look at what other questions we've got. Have you ever tried naalbinding with horse or cow hair or plant fibres? I've been trying actually to get hold of horse and cow hair, and I think I found an ethical supplier, which is really good. I'm constantly naalbinding my own hair into woolen items, so there's a parallel there. But yes, I have naalbound with nettle too. Some of those early Mesolithic examples from Tiberian Vig actually are made out of nettle and hair too. So yeah, it's really weird in a fascinating way when you use plant fibres and hair fibres for naalbinding, because with wool obviously you can coax it and flatten the stitches a bit more and get them to interlock, so you feel like you have more of a textile when you're doing it when you're naalbinding with wool. With cow and horse hair, it's obviously a lot thicker in some cases than human hair, but you can see why it would be used as something like a milk strainer. You know, you can see the practical choices that have been made for why that has been oh, that's handy. If you press the one symbol in the corner, it has a mirroring option so the text don't look wonky. Oh, I'm going to try that. Oh god, no, that's far too advanced. No, that's not going to happen, Alex. No. So yes, sorry, getting distracted by a recommendation from Alex there. Yeah, no, I definitely have wanted to naalbind with cow and horsehair. That's on the to-do list. And nettle, again, is really, really strong, really interesting material to work with. I've made my own nettle string before, where you're just pulling the fibres, pulling the dried fibres out, and then you're splicing the yarn together. Let's see, yarn, nettle fibre together, the bast fibre together. Yeah, so you've got some really interesting finishes actually. please share all that info on your Facebook page, please. I will try. I mean, that's one of the things that I do, is when I'm not going, ooh, look at this thing I've made, is I'm always got my foot in the heritage, obviously, and archaeology world, for my own research, but also for my other job that I do as an archaeologist. So yeah, any archaeological information, obviously regarding nalbinding or access to journal articles, I will always try and share onto my Nidavellnir Facebook page, as long as it's all publicly accessible. Book recommendations that we can go through in a moment if you fancy. But yeah, I'm always wary and mindful of sharing out extracts on social media of stuff that's been written by other people and published by other people, because it's their work, and I don't mind doing shout outs for stuff, going, oh, look at this book. But in terms of ownership and copywriting and respect for the author as well, I would rather share digital stuff as and where I can. So yeah, noted. I will definitely try and put up resources. Also, guys, feel free to email me or message me on Facebook Messenger. Are interested in a particular area of what we've spoken about? Yeah, just message me any questions. Oh, that was a really good question there from Maria. Are you only nalbinding without the thumb? No, I do thumb stitches as well. I do York stitch. I do Dublin stitch. I do Oslo stitch. Not my favourite stitch. What you tend to find with nalbinding, obviously, because there's quite a lot of nalbinding stitches, different cultural stitches, different applications and stuff, when people fall into the tunnel of nalbinding and go, whoa, everybody wants to try all the different stitches, which is great. I don't craft like that. I'm a bit of a glutton for punishment in the sense that I like to deconstruct and understand the practical application of each stitch. So I will only move on to learning another stitch when I am happy in myself that I have got that nalbinding stitch down to the historical equivalent, which is why I've gone single Danish stitch. I've spent a year nailing York stitch and still nailing York stitch. You know, I'm pretty happy with it, but I'm still working with it. My next one is Dublin, and then I've got a couple of other ones that I want to get on with. So that's the thing, I don't have a problem in picking up the stitches in terms of learning and understanding how they're being created, but I would like to give myself the time and the craft, the appreciation to be able to sit there and go, okay, no, this year or two, I'm gonna smash this stitch. I'm gonna make hats, socks and gloves out of this stitch, see how it works, see how, you know, the whole technique unfolds, and go from there, really. But yeah, I use thumb stitches, I use casting onto the needle as well, but yeah, loads of different techniques. Yes, please, book recommendations, says Chrissy. Awesome. Well, let's do that while I've still got some time. I've got some time. We've all got time, haven't we? We've all got nothing but time. Oh dear. So yeah, I'm not gonna go into too much detail about these book recommendations, but I'll give a brief overview of why I think it's good and what its merits are, each book. I'll say where it falls down a little bit, but all the books that I've got have got, you know, pros and cons too. Just like I imagine people will read my book and go, oh yeah, she's crap this bit and she's not explained that bit. So it's the way it goes, isn't it? Yeah, the first book is this one you'll see advertised on the internet. And now I know it is back to front, I do apologise, but I don't want to change any settings because that would be bad. It's by Ulrike Klassenbutner, and it's called What in the World Is That? Nalbinding, or Nalbinding, What in the World Is That? History and Technique of an Almost Forgotten Handicraft. Now in here, the thing for me that is gold dust there is sort of by period, as in historical period, there is a breakdown of all the different archaeological examples of nalbinding, of the stitches and how they've been found in the archaeology, and what classification technique has been applied to describe them, which is really nice. When I say classification system, those hardcore nalbinders out there will be aware of Margaretha Hald's academic works in these regarding textiles from Danish bogs. You've also got Hansen's work, which I have as well, which was recently updated by his daughter. And when I say classifications in nalbinding, there have been several different and that have assessed nalbinding and created a system to assess it as such. Some of them are employing ethnographic parallels and the under-over system. Some are employing a mathematical code like you would with modern knitting. Some are employing a pattern basis. But the important thing to learn with these classifications, like I said before, nalbinding historically is not done on a pattern system. You can translate it into a modern pattern system because you've got the hindsight of modern knitting and crochet to fall upon, to be able to go, oh yeah, I can see where that fits in. But in this book, like I say, what's really good is that you have the core of archaeological evidence. You get explained what classification system's being used. In every nalbinding book that I have read, you always tend to get the author trying to explain the historical and archaeological background, which is great. And then you also get the part where they're trying to do the how-to, the tutorial bit. The tutorial bit in this book is not great. I don't know whether that's because it gets lost in translation a little bit, because it had been translated out of German into English. And the pictures are a little bit small. If you're very much a visual learner, you find it quite difficult to learn from this book. But like I say, this is a really, really good book for getting those archaeological key case studies. And it's got really good references in the back as well. If you're an archaeology nut and you want to go and find or try and find another source or another paper or something, this book's got the references in the back, which is really, really nice too. So from an archaeological point of view, this book is really handy to have as reference material for sure. This Mariana Overby one is the Hansen classification book, which my brain, mathematics, doing something by a set sequence, challenging at the best of times, just managed to do single context recording. Great as an archaeologist. So yeah, there's that. And then we've got some more general books that I'd really recommend as well, that do have sections about nalbinding in as well. So all the wonderful reenactment and heritage people out there, I'm sure you are aware of Thor Ewing's book, Viking-Age Clothing. That has got a little section, a little blurb in there about hats, socks, gloves, and nalbinding has a paragraph. So it doesn't have an awful lot, but it does kind of highlight some key case studies of nalbound items. And it's just a really good book, actually, in terms of clothing and historical portrayals. It's, even though it was written in the 80s, it's actually still quite a good comprehensive book, actually, on early medieval Anglian, Anglo-Scandinavian, Hibernian, Norse-ish type clothing portrayals. So yeah, that's a really good one. And then for those of you that want to try and part the complex nature of nalbinding, twill, herringbone fabrics, all sorts. You've got Cloth and Clothing in Early Anglo-Saxon England by Penelope Walton Rogers. The interesting thing about this is that she talks about obviously the Coppergate sock a little bit, only in reference, because obviously we've only got a time period from 450 to 700 here in this book, so it gives you a nice early comparison. But it's a really good prelude, really, to understanding the kind of textile working and material and processes and craft that's going on in the pre-Viking period. So you get a nice understanding of that Anglo-Scandinavian blending of culture period, and then obviously being able to recognise when more Scandinavian techniques are actually coming into, which is really good. Written by a Viking Age textile specialist. Great references, great resources, all the case studies. Quite hard reading unless you understand archaeological gubbins, but still a really, really good book. Really, really good book by Penelope. Yes. So yeah, those are just a few that I wanted to state about, really. Just going to have another little whiz through the questions here. Oh, beep, beep. Are there any archaeological examples of larger clothing items in naalbinding? Great question. No. When we're talking about the Viking Age, all we have are hats, socks, gloves, possibly a pouch. That might be the Dublin fragment. They've suggested that might be like a coin pouch or something. But in terms of like the hoods, the nail-bound hoods, nail-bound jumpers, nail-bound bags, like the Burka and Hedeby bags, we haven't found any of those archaeologically at all. So it doesn't mean that you can't use that nail binding technology to make those items, obviously, because you've got some really talented people that can do the nail bound sweaters. Some of them I've seen recently on following on a couple of groups and pages, absolutely phenomenal. I'm sure at some point in my life I'll make a nail-bound jumper for myself, but the amount of skill and time that would go into making that is incredible. But it is very much a modern adaptation of an ancient craft, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're, you know, open and honest and you go, yeah, I'm using an ancient craft to create a really awesome jumper. Good for you. But no, the thing is, in the historical Viking period, if you are wanting to make any clothing, you are using your loom, you are weaving your fabric and cut out your patterns and make your items in that manner, rather than nail binding garments like tunics and tops and trousers and stuff like that in nail binding. So you'll probably notice that an awful lot of Viking Age clothing is all very tubular, and that is because of how their textile making process works. Of course, something could be found tomorrow that makes us completely rethink, you know, textile making and garment making in the 10th century. We could find more evidence of nail-bound bags as well. We've got there's another really good example. The Vasa ship in Sweden had a beautiful little Oslo nail-bound coin purse, little coin bag that was found in that shipwreck, that has been lovingly restored and conserved, and it's absolutely awesome. But that shipwreck actually dates to the 17th century, so that just goes to show that yes, nail binding has been used since year dot, but it has carried on in some cultures and countries longer than in others. So in England, we lost that cultural transition when we started to get more Dutch and continental influence, and we started to get two needle knitting coming in, and obviously with the introduction of the spinning wheel and the changing of cloth and textile making techniques, whereas in places like Sweden and Finland, nalbinding has still carried on as part of a traditional craft, a folklorist craft. It's got its own tales and stories attached to it, which is fascinating. It's an interesting part of social history for those cultures. So yeah, not really a thing you want to be using to nalbinding big items of clothing, really. Doesn't stop people giving it a go, and if you want to make something like that, go for it. You can still obviously wear it in the modern day. Entirely up to you. Once you've cracked the craft and you want to make whatever you want to make. I've known people that have made phone cases, makeup bags, bottle covers, all sorts of things, really. So that's where nalbinding crosses the divide of becoming a heritage craft, because you can apply a historical technique, archaeological technique. You can understand the stitch and the application with reverence, but then you can use your skill as a crafter to then create something new. So that's when you start to become more of an artist, I guess. You know, it's that crossover between a craftsperson and an artist, you know, which is something that actually doesn't get spoken about an awful lot in archaeological circles. The practicalities, obviously, of the archaeological remains and what the evidence is telling us, but in terms of artistic representation and individualistic expression of crafts people throughout the past, yeah, that's an interesting one to think about, actually. I've nalbinded a shawl in a triangle. Good for you, Heather. Good for you. All credit to you, honestly. Some of the sweaters and the jumpers that I've seen that have been nalbound recently are phenomenal. Yeah, and like I say, I've got an idea of one that I'd like to do. It'd be like a Christmas jumper for me, but as with everything with nalbinding, it is the time, because this is a very time-intensive craft. You're obviously doing one stitch at a time. Sometimes you can do, obviously, depending on what stitch you're doing, you do 2 stitches at a time. But yeah, jumpers and shawls, well done. Well done. Let's have a look at some more questions. Oh, I don't want to do that. There we go. That was a little hat of my other gonk. My little tomt man. Oh, well, that's good. We've still got 26 people watching. Hi, 26 people. That's really cool. It took you a week to make the triangle shawl. Well done. Do I know of any nalbinding traditions from Russia? I know of some examples of nalbound items from Russia. They are medieval in date. They're socks, hats, and possibly a coif, like a head coif thing for putting on underneath the helm. In terms of folklore, I'm afraid I don't know an awful lot about folklore and traditions regarding textile making in Russia. That would be something for me, myself, to actually read up upon. Most of my knowledge is purely Northern European and North Atlantic based, really, because that's what my specialism is as an archaeologist. It's all sort of Scandinavian Viking period, even though I've got a good grounding in general British archaeology and history. When I did my master's degree, I specialised in the Viking period. So, yeah, there you go. La, 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 la. My first socks looked like submarines. So did mine. No, saying that, that's a fib. The first, I tried to make a sock. This was probably about 12 years or so ago when I first started learning how to nalbind. I tried to make a sock because, again, I thought, oh, I can make a sock. That looks easy. Why not? Give it a go. Boy, I was wrong. So rather than making a sock, I just created a tube and didn't know what to do with it. It was a very strange shaped tube. I think I've got it in the wardrobe somewhere still. But I didn't want to, obviously one of the first things that I've ever nail bound, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't want to throw it away like my hat. It was like a memory piece. So yeah, I turned it into a hand puppet. I gave it like little curly hair. I embroidered in some little eyes. When I was doing living history and Viking period talks to kids and talking about sagas and storytelling and stuff, I put this little hand puppet that was nail bound on as a little sidekick to talk to people with. So yeah, there you go. We all have very interesting first make stories for sure. That's a really good topic actually, first make stories. How weird was your first make when it came to nail? Learned loads, gotta run. Thank you for this. No, well, I do have a YouTube channel. For me, it's just a matter of trying to generate content, really, because I don't have the means to generate really good quality content that would help really Dolores. But thank you. I have got some Etsy stuff up. And like I say, I'll try and keep posting. But yeah, now that this is obviously gone well, I hope, and got a bit of a swing of things of how to do it here, I might maybe do some more live videos, even if it's just a sit and naalbind with Brunny for a couple of hours in the evening while we're all slowly going loopy. Keeps everybody company, doesn't it? So yeah, but thank you for that. I'm glad you've learned something. Keep pressing the wrong button. Oh dear. Do we have any more questions, you lovely people? Any more questions? Oh, just got reposition. Oh. Yes, 2 more, I will tune in. Yeah, okay, awesome. I feel sorry for Neflaug, who's put me on a TV screen, plugged me into the TV. Nobody's face should be that big. Goodness me. I apologise. Think of something next time. Yeah, good idea. Do you have references for Tybring Vig? There are published books for Tybring Vig. There's the excavation report partially available online. If you type in Tybring Vig archaeological excavation, you should get some material. I know they did put a lot of the material up on the website too. And also, guys, the other thing to bear in mind is if you are genuinely obviously wanting to learn and interested in the references and the sources and further historical content, a lot of museums and museum collections and archaeological collections have an open access policy when it comes to viewing material and accessing references. So all you need to do is find the appropriate museum or where the collection, or email them to try and find out what materials and resources are available. And sometimes they can send you digital copies. You know, it cost a couple of quid for them to email it to you. But yeah, an awful lot of museums and collections, you can get some of these access papers on. Obviously, because I'm an alumna and I've got an affiliation with York University, I get an awful lot of my academic journals and information excavation reports for free. And also I've had them from doing my own research, and I can access different journal sites too. So yeah, never feel weird or funny about asking for references or anything like that, because at the end of the day, this is all, you know, fascinating and interesting for everybody. Hey Adam. Look great, get a TV show. Oh, thanks. Oh, that's hilarious. Brilliant. There you go. Well, I'm glad that people have seemed to have enjoyed this. I've been looking at... Oh, I see what you mean, Puku. Regarding Tybring Vig. Yeah, I think the Tybring Vig textiles volume is out of print, and I don't know whether they've digitised it fully. I'll have a look. Let me have a look. I'll chase that one up and get back to you on that. But yeah. All I can do is Danish stitch. Whenever I try a more complex stitch, all I can make are some funky knots. Any tips on how to transition onto a more complex stitch to make it more successful? Yes. If you're doing Danish stitch, don't go onto Oslo. That's not like for me anyway, when I'm teaching people, that's not a natural progression. Yeah, no, if you draw out the stitches, it's whatever works, you know. Some people can learn by watching a video. Some people need to do step-by-step descriptions and instructions. Some people need a person sitting there next to them to talk through stuff. I really would recommend trying York stitch. It's not as scary as it seems. And the thing is, the one thing that actually we haven't spoken about is the fact that there is no way to do a wrong naalbinding stitch at all. You have the front of the textile and you have the back of the textile, or you have the inner and the outer, and you get two different finishes, one on the inner and one on the outer. So if you are naalbinding away from you, you are going to get the proper form on the outside. If you feel more comfortable naalbinding towards you, there's nothing wrong with that. You're just going to get the reversed form of the pattern on your textiles. And I happen to really like the reversed form on a lot of these textiles. And that's just personal preference, and also how I prefer to craft and how my wrists work as well. So yeah, you can naalbind in two different ways. I would very much recommend, like I say, the York stitch, because you're not actually picking up a stitch like you are with Oslo. You're literally just going through one loop and behind the others and then pulling through. So once you do York stitch, that should give you a better understanding of when you go on to, you know, the double loop and the more complex stitches like Oslo and others. That should help for sure. Okay, thank you, you're welcome. Adam says, how's the foot? Still attached, thankfully. Still attached. That's the thing, Neflag. We do, when it comes to crafting, you know, everybody's got their own little methods and techniques to be able to either let the information sink in or to learn. Everybody learns in a different way. And after having many years of learning how to teach people in various roles, you know, that's what actually inspired me to write the Nalbinding for Beginners book, because everybody was having the same problem. Talking to people over 10 years, going, oh, what's this interesting craft? How do I start it? Everybody goes, oh, that sounds too complicated, too difficult. You're welcome. Hashtag attempt 203. Brilliant. You'll get there. You'll get there. I've been doing the same stitch for years and years and years and years, and it's only taken me in the last 5 years or so to have the confidence to be able to go, nah, try another stitch. You know, refine that skill onto something else. So you take as long as you need. No rush. No rush at all. I'm surprised it's got 25 people still on board. That's grand. Thanks, guys. Okie dokie. Does anybody else have any other questions at all? Nalbinding related, archaeology related, Viking related, reenactment related. We'll throw the net a bit wider for a little while, if you fancy. Or if there's anything that I've missed, or not really spoken about much, or you need clarifying at all. Yes, honestly, Liz, when I am going to definitely sort out doing the workshops. Like I say, I was hoping to do the in-person workshops for this autumn, but with everything going wonky, I think that might have to be next autumn. But I am going to be, it's something that I definitely want to do, even if it's like once a month in York thing. I've managed to look at a couple of venues. I've got all the resources and materials I need. Kind of know how I'd like to teach people as well. So yeah, I like teaching face to face. Can I double up the wall using York stitch? Alex, yes you can. Depends on the weight of the yarn that you're using to begin with. So, for example, if you are doing a York stitch and you are using a worsted thickness or a chunky, super chunky weight like this, then doubling up, obviously, you're going to create something that is rather hefty on the depth, which you might find a little challenging. Whereas if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 DK Aran yarn like this and you want to double up just to get a little bit more of a sturdier textile, yeah, you can definitely double up. I've got a lot of really nice finely hand spun, hand dyed Madder Weld and Wode yarn that I still haven't used yet because I'm really wanting to make a nice project out of those. And I haven't got round to doing it yet, but I will definitely be doubling them up when I get round to it, actually. What about Norman reenactment? Do you think they would naalbind in England during the 12th century? Isabel, oh, that's a great question. Well, we know that naalbinding continues on, historically, into the 12th century in Northern Europe. In Sweden in particular, possibly in Denmark too. We know that the Normans are coming from a Scandinavian lineage and heritage too. Limited archaeology, but possible. There are many people that do medieval and 12th century and Norman reenactment that want a craft to be able to demonstrate to the public, want a fibre craft to demonstrate to the public, but they don't want to have to do obviously knitting or crochet, which is definitely too modern for that medieval period. So yeah, you could stretch it forward a little bit into the medieval period in England, but as long as you are explaining to the public when you're demonstrating that this is a much earlier craft technology and that there is limited archaeological evidence, explain where the evidence is coming from other comparative cultural sources, you should be fine. But there aren't any 12th century or Norman period or medieval examples of naalbinding that have been found in England. Just had a little flag ping up in my brain to say there might be an 18th century English example, but I think that was brought over from a Danish individual. Yeah, but this is what I mean, the narrative, the chronology, like with a lot of other items and craft technologies, from an archaeological point of view, normally, if you've got enough data, you can create a nice timeline, a nice typology of how things evolved and, what time period, certain techniques were introduced and developed and such. With naalbinding, especially in the UK, and even just focusing it in England, we've got such large gaps. It's really difficult to try and figure out what's going on in the middle. Cool. I'm just having a read of some of the comments that you guys are responding to. Alex was just sort of saying about the York stitch, doubling it up, making it thicker. Cool. Well, I hopefully look forward to seeing you next year then, Liz. That would be great. Oh, that's one thing we haven't spoken about is needles, nulls, the whole null and the nalbinding story. What is your favourite null to use? Long, short, fat, thin, round, flat? All sorts, isn't there? I don't actually know when my null is. That's helpful. Hello. Well, I do have a null. She's currently AWOL. Where are you? Oh, fool. My favourite null, to answer Arlene's question, and it's on the blue inside. Glasses on, I'm still blind as a bat. Right, nalbinding needles. So, from an archaeological point of view again, in the Viking period in particular, we have evidence for bone, horn, wood, nalbinding needles. Bone, horn, wood, nalbinding, yeah. And I've used all of them over the years. And what? Oh, and antler. Of course, I knew there was another one that I missed. Antler too. So you've got bone, antler, wood, horn. Horn nalbinding needles are good for a little while, but because obviously horn is based on a set of keratin laminates, I used a horn needle for about 6 months, and then from the end of the needle the laminates started to open up and it started to peel, and obviously then it started to shed in effect, and the needle got thinner and thinner and flimsier and flimsier, and then the horn was done. So yeah, not a great material if you're nalbinding horn. Antler was really good, it wears really well. Depends on how you make the antler ones. If you're going for, you can make a really fine thin antler needle, but what I've found is that the eye ends of the needle tend to break in antler, and I think that's because sometimes obviously when you're doing your stitches you've got to give the yarn a little bit of a tug if you get knotted, or if the wool sort of binds back on itself a little bit. So yeah, I find with the antler, the sort of like the eye end of the needle can ping off. Wood is good. Wood is good. I'm actually making some wooden nalbinding needles at the moment for my own range of nalbinding needles. That's for your information. Once updated. Yeah, these little guys. So yeah, we've only got 1 or 2 examples of wooden nalbinding needles, and they're sort of right at the end of the Viking period, so the 11th century. There are a few more wooden nalbinding needles from the sort of 12th century in Sweden for sure. And these are fine. What I tend to find with the wooden nalbinding needles is that you can snap them. No matter what wood they are, sometimes you can snap them, and sometimes you get splinters if it hasn't been treated or correctly. You'll start to get little splintery bits in the wood, so obviously that has its pros and cons too. So all of this waffling and rambling is leading us naturally onto bone. Binding needle. I've had this binding needle for 6 years. As you can see, it has worn down. It is very highly polished. Out of the metapodial of a sheep, so that's the lower leg of a sheep. It's ethically sourced bone. It has some wear around where the eyelet hole is. Obviously where I've been pulling and, you know, doing the naalbinding and the tension's been coming through. And because it's bone, and I like to do my naalbinding, the tension is really tight. I like to keep really tight stitches. I've got quite a small, sharp point on this now, which is quite deadly when you're stabbing. But that's the thing. And archaeologically, there are so many different types of material that naalbinding needles are made from, as well as fat ones, thin ones, all sorts. For a beginner, I would very much recommend a long-ish thin needle. And the thing is, when you're first learning to naalbind, these kinds of needles really help because you have a nice narrow back end here, so that when you go through your textile, you can control the stitch and the tension a bit better. Whereas if you have a wider back end in your needle, like so, the thickness of the stitch that you're going to be able to create, it's going to be quite open, it's going to be quite loose, which is not what naalbinding is about. The whole point of naalbinding as a craft is that you do one stitch at a time, so you can interlock each stitch one next to the other. Naalbinding historically is not meant to appear like crochet finished textile. It's meant interlocked and solid and sturdy, and we see that from the archaeological evidence, you know, and the socks and the hats and the mittens that are found. Yeah, it's a denser textile for sure, and the only way you're going to get that really nice dense textile is if you are pulling your tension really tight. I prefer to not tension off of the needle, which I know is a popular method. I like to do the tensioning myself, and that is me then pulling the stitch through and making sure that each stitch is the same size and thickness, by me giving the yarn a bit of a tug at the end as well, rather than letting the needle do the work and just leaving the stitch to come off of the needle at the end. I just like to have more control over the textile, the finished textile look at the end, when I'm naalbinding. But there are other finishes and other ways to do it as well. That's a great question, Arlene. Needles. Woo! Oh, Susan's got one. Is there any evidence of naalbinding in southern Spain? As the merino sheep were bred historically for their fine fleece, they were indeed, in northern Spain, and herded in their thousands to grazing in the south annually. They were. There was a big Persian Arab influence in southern Spain. There was. Last year when I went to the textiles conference up in Glasgow, I spoke to a textile historian from Spain, and a textile archaeologist from Spain, and I spoke to them about naalbinding, and they had never heard of it before, and I spoke to them a bit more about it because you know, sometimes it can be, well, I've never heard of this before, have I missed it, you know, is it something within our culture historically that we've got and you've just never heard of, or oh well, no, I know about everything, you know, from our cultural history, what's been created, and we just don't have it. And she didn't seem to say that it was a thing historically in Spain, which is interesting. So yeah, and I really can't, I'm stretching my brain to think of archaeological sites and examples in Spain, and even in northern Spain actually, where textile making, they've got loads of loom weights on the sites, but nothing naalbinding related. And of course as well in Spain, with the soil conditions and the arid nature of the soil conditions, textile preservation is just non-existent. What they do tend to find in Spain, I know from talking to this lady at the conference, was that in some of the medieval castles in Spain, they do have some of the tapestries surviving, but it's only because they've been sort of taken down and shoved into wall cavities, or a floor level has, and bits of the textile has survived in that way. But yeah, I don't know an awful lot about Spanish textile archaeology, I'm afraid. But from what I can piece together, I really don't think there is that cultural tradition of nalbinding in Spain, as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong. Could be wrong. Isabella, thank you. You're welcome. No problem at all. 22 people still watching. Well, thank you, 22 people. That's very kind. I have no idea how long I've been waffling. Like I say, I'm using my phone, so I've got no idea of time, universe, or anything as such. So yeah, I'm going to do a last shout out for if anybody has got any further questions. Now's your time. Ask away. But it's been really, really interesting, actually, to see the kind of things that people were curious to know about. It's always really interesting to see, for me, from a sort of, I get a mixture of archaeology questions, obviously, because of my specialism, but also how-to questions as well, with nalbinding and, you know, pointers and tips and how do I do this and what's the best thing to approach to use with this. So that's really nice. I like to combine the archaeology and heritage aspects of this particular craft together. So that's really cool. Oh yeah, I totally get you, Susan. Yeah, no, definitely there's a massive wool trade. That's the thing. And the wool trade in England, that's why in the 12th century in England everything changes with textile production, because of our wool trade. We did love our shape in England during the medieval period. So yeah. Oh, got another good question. Alexandra goes, do you think any embroidery, tablet weave would have been added or decoration? Or decorated, I guess. Yes, but not from the Viking period. We don't have examples from the best, if you like, the best embroidery and tablet braiding and fringing on nail-bound items tend to come from the 18th century from Sweden and Finland. And those are just wonderful examples of individual family and village variation. Really, really beautiful. So yeah, they're a lot later, very pretty, but no evidence for tablet braid on items during the Viking period. There is, that's the point, we haven't spoken about that. A textile that came from a Danish site, name escapes me now, but it's a chlad, and a chlad is like a band of fabric. It's tablet braid, silk and gold thread, and it's a band of fabric that would go over the front of the forehead and tie back round to hold a wimple, to hold a headscarf, a head covering in place. And there is null-bound gold thread along the rim of the chlad itself. And there's also null-bound needlework, gold thread needlework in Mammon, in the Mammon grave too. It might be Mammon. So yeah, it's not common. Those items are certainly elite and representing elitist individuals, because the craft level of that is incredible. But yeah, the whole idea of added decoration and embroidery is certainly a lot later. But especially in there might be a couple of examples in Norway actually of the 18th century embroidery and fringing and stuff. In Norway and Sweden in particular, they've got some really lovely cultural, traditional folk museums where they've got some of them being displayed, and they're really, really pretty. Really, really cool. So yeah, it's kind of a half answer for you there, Alexandra. 1.5 hours already? Blimey, I do like to waffle on, don't I? There you go. Oh, that's a fabulous question, Dorota. Why do naalbinding needles have 1, 2 or 3 holes in them from a beginner? Great question. Well, what some people like to do when they are naalbinding, and there are archaeological examples of these naalbinding needles too, they tend to follow a little bit of a typology. It's about speeding up the process of naalbinding. So the most traditional and historically correct needle use is just with one. If you're talking about early cultures, sort of medieval and pre-medieval cultures, you just tend to see that there's a lot of one whole eye needles being used. What tends to happen into the medieval period later, from 1100 onwards, in Sweden and Finland and Norway in particular, you start to see 2 holes coming in. And what that is all about is that you are stacking your thread. So once you have pulled off sections of yarn, let's say 2 arms lengths full of yarn that you're going to be working on, you've attached it to your item and you're going to carry on working with it, that long tail end that might get felted back in as you're working, you would then take it and loop it backwards and forwards and forwards and backwards and forwards through the hole. So it's kind of stacked on the needle a little bit, if you like, a bit like a shuttle in effect. And then later on, especially through into the 16th and 17th century in Sweden, you start to see the 3 holes. So it's just so you can stack more, you can work with longer lengths and you can stack more lengths of yarn onto your naalbinding needle as well. I have tried that method. I just don't like it. It just makes the needle feel really bulky, really cumbersome. You don't have that fluidity that you have. I know it's very repetitive and, you know, you're doing a lot of large arm movements and you're working with long lengths of yarn when you're just using the one-eyed needle. Yeah, that's what the eye loophole things are all about. It's about speeding up the process of naalbinding. It's about stacking up your yarn so that you can make stuff quicker, but for a beginner I really would not recommend that, because it's just going to sort of it's not going to aid your crafting very well, because you've got to be able to get the technique, get the principles, get the stitch down, and then if you're trying to fight with yarn and needle and all sorts afterwards as well, it's just another thing to not help, basically. But yeah, no, really good question actually, that, Dorota. Thank you for that. We're slowly starting to lose people. We've still got 20 people watching though. Well done, guys. Thank you. Been waffling for an hour and a half and 20 people are still listening. Oh, blimey. Awesome. Well, seeing as I have been waffling for an hour and a half, and I think we have covered quite a lot of different bits and bobs, and it seems to have gone down well. You know, you've all been very kind and said that, you know, I've answered your questions, and, you know, you've come back with follow-up questions, and it's all been pretty productive, I think, which has been really, really nice. So I think I might end Nidavellnir's first live chat. I think it's just a good introductory chat. What my face looks like, and this is the person behind Nidavellnir, and the posts that go up, and the items that you see, and if you see me at a trade show or a reenactment fair in the future, you know, look out for the red hat. It's always constantly attached to my head. Yes, I don't blame you for going to bed. I'm definitely going to sort of go and have a chill out now myself. But thank you ever so much, everybody. You all stay safe. I know these are all uncertain times and we're all doing the best we can. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Alexandra. You stay safe too. And yeah, I'll see if I can sort out a sequence, if you like, of different live stream themes, whether it's myth busting, beginners, stitches, maybe as well. So yeah, if you have anything that you would like me to cover, like in an evening session, please, yeah, just give me a message, give me a shout. Thank you, Isabel, that's very kind of you. You too, Arlene, you stay safe too, thank you. The really nice thing for me has been to actually sort of, not talk, but inadvertently talk to people that are friends that I know, people that I've met recently as well as to sort of reach across the divide of different countries and talk to people that I've been, chatting backwards and forwards on my page for a while. Thank you, Heather. It's great. Time for a drink. Yes, very much so. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you stay safe too as well, Liz. I'm glad you've enjoyed listening to me waffle. Oh, you're welcome, Jenny. Thank you. You stay well and safe too, Neflaug. I'm sorry for my face being on your telly so big. But yeah, no, it's been really nice. Nice comments, really interesting questions as well. So yeah, I think from my two little helpers behind me as well, we were going to probably sign off for the night. I'm going to chill out for a bit. Not going to do any more nail binding today because I've been making wooden nail binding needles. So I've got some small fingers, rest those up. And of course it's the Easter weekend, so I might go and have some chocolate or something as well. Why not? Yes, please, more live streams, says Catherine. Okie dokie, I'll get on it. Yeah, you take care too. Okay then, everybody. Well, thank you so much for all the interesting questions and all the lovely feedback. And once I get another live stream all up and running sorted, which I'm feeling quite confident about now, I will let you know. So yeah, stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Really love chatting to you all. And we'll talk soon. Stay safe, everybody. Good night for now. Bye bye. Thank you for the thumbs up and the hearts and the love. Happy nail binding. Happy nail binding. Awesome. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.